Non-retrogradable rhythms and medieval Neumes. That sounds like a bit of a specious juxtaposition, doesn't it? But it's one that I'm going to talk about today in this video. Today we're looking at chapter 5 of Olivier Messiaen's book, The Techniques of My Musical Language. This is part of a series of videos that I'm doing. If you like it, you can always find the earlier episodes in the playlist, and of course you can subscribe and you'll get notification of any future ones. Today, chapter 5, non-retrogradable rhythms. It's quite a short chapter in the book. You can see that it prints out to only a single double-sided page. But the idea of non-retrogradable rhythms is one that Messiaen has touched on in earlier chapters. We've talked about it. What he does in this chapter is specifically describe how to create a non-retrogradable rhythm. What's the, if you wanted a formal definition of retrograde, non-retrograde, what is that? And a couple of examples of how to build it. So at the end of the lecture today, after we've gone through everything, including the pneumatic tangent, I'm going to take the etude that I've been working on and take one of those melodic sections and actually apply some non-retrograde to it so it builds out a little bit according to what we're learning today. Again, non-retrogradable rhythms and medieval Neumes. Medieval Neumes being the square note notation of Gregorian chant. It's an interesting comparison. Neumes are graphic in a way that particularly compared to how we think of notation today, which is very specific in terms of pitch and dynamics and duration. There's a lot of information in a modern score we don't see in the notation of Neumes. But they are relationships. Neumes define relationships of pitch and tempo. And in that sense, they align very well to how Messiaen thinks of rhythmic cells, whether retrograde or non-retrogradable. You hear this clicking. It's a terrible bad habit I have, partly because I'm an appalling videographer. A number of you have asked what it is, this little bead here. Such a piece of turquoise and tied to a thread here. It was an artifact that was used in a longevity ritual offered by my teacher, who is a monk in the Bon Buddhist tradition. And the turquoise sits on the altar through the ritual, and at the end of it, it's sort of a little encapsulation of the power and energy of the ritual. Longevity and soul retrieval in Bon means something a little bit different from probably what you think in sort of modern Western spirituality, particularly if there's a New Age element to it, where we think of soul retrieval as going out and acquiring missing parts of ourselves, healing through that way. The soul and longevity in the Bon tradition are slightly different terminology. The soul is what binds longevity to the life force, right? We are given a certain allotted number of days at our birth, and then according to the rules of karma and our ability to maneuver through the obscurations and delusions of our life, we either manage to accede to all of the full allotted amount of time, or we don't. And so the soul retrieval and longevity practice is to purify the connection between our allotted days and then our actual health and well-being. And this little bead here is from that ritual. The longevity ritual was a long time ago, maybe almost 10 years ago now. But and I used to wear it around my neck here. With the recent pandemic and my concerns about health and well-being in general, I took this out and just quickly wrapped it around my wrist, a couple months ago when we all were in lockdown for the first time, and just kind of kept it there. And it's a little bit awkward because it does dangle and it looks a little bit silly, but that's what this is. We'll talk more about the Bon tradition later. There might be some nice overlap between some of the liturgical interests that Messiaen has in his music, and then some of the interests I have in liturgy from the Bon tradition. Non-retrogradable rhythms. Actually, speaking of New Age and astrology and stuff, in astrology we talk about the retrograde motions of planets. Not just in astrology. I think they talk about it in astronomy as well, in the legitimate sciences. But when a planet is in retrograde, it appears to be moving backwards in relation to the orbit around the Earth, and that is because we are moving around a central location, and every once in a while those things line up, so the planets appear to move sort of like this. Right, that's the retrograde part. It's the reverse direction when observed from the Earth, caused by those differences in the orbit. That is retrograde. It is a contrapuntal procedure. Messiaen describes it. Reading from right to left what normally ought to be read from left to right. And applied to rhythm alone, it gives some curious reversals of values. So he has two examples, 28 and 29. 29 is the retrograde of 28. 28 he describes as a typical formula of our rhythmic fancies, right? It's got the different cases of augmentation, diminution, inexact replication. You can see how in the first measure B is a diminution of A, and that A is 3 quarter notes and B is 3/8 notes, except at the cross he added a dot. So we talked about this a lot in the previous video, and I'll see if I can add a card linking back to that video where we talk about augmentation and diminution. But the inexact diminution of A yields B. In the second measure, where A is 3/8 notes, so the actual diminution, the division of equal parts of A, which is the 3 quarter notes, becomes the 3/8 notes. And then in B, the 3/8 notes are augmented by the dot. Oh, but then there's an added note thrown in, the 16th note at the end of B. Messiaen notes that this is the total of the example 28 is 13 quarter notes split amongst those different ametrical rhythms. So remember, ametricality is the breaking up of a consistent pulse into different metrical units that then can be juxtaposed, alternated, and then augmented or diminished. You see, he's notated this without a clef, so I'm just going to assume that it's a treble clef. Let's say that's our 16th note. And then if I play the retrograde, the augmentations become diminutions, the additions become subtractions, and likewise. Right, so their examples 28 and 29 are retrograde. They have a retrograde relationship, meaning you can read one left to right, the other right to left, and it'll be the same. Messiaen notes that in chapter 6, which is the chapter after this one, he talks about the superposition of a rhythm upon its retrograde. which is sort of a canonical technique, a technique of overlaying rhythms. He doesn't do this in the examples. You can see that I struggled a bit to write it out here on the pencil sketch on the example, but I'm going to give it a shot just so you can hear how interesting it is to hear, even with just a pulse. I'm not going to put any pitch content in here. You can hear the overlap of the two. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Try that a second time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, So those are retrogradable rhythms. You can read them left to right, and then right to left, and they will be different. Non-retrogradable rhythms, that doesn't hold true. When you read them left to right and right to left, you have the same. The first examples are very basic, right? With 3 notes, and obviously if you have 3 notes, and 1 and 3 are the same, regardless of what the middle is, they're not going to retrograde, right? So example 30, you have an 8th note, a 16th note, an 8th note. And of course, flip it around, it's going to be the same. 31, there are 3 examples, always the same. 3 notes are very easy. But don't let that diminish the power of the idea, because when you extend beyond 3 notes, so you have 2 notes that are the same in a central value, well, that is actually the core of non-retrogradability, where you have 3 units, the middle one is shared between the second 2, and where the end units are the retrograde of each other, then you have a non-retrogradable unit. Messiaen puts it this way: if we go beyond the figure of 3 values, the principle grows, and we should say all rhythms divisible into 2 groups, one of which is the retrograde of the other, with a central common value, are non-retrogradable. So example 32, you can see that the central value is the tied quarter note, the quarter note in the 16th note. And the other cell is 2 8th notes and a dotted 8th note. Then in the second part, that's retrograded, the dotted 8th and then 2 8ths. Okay, now we've looked at this, and even the examples don't have clef, right? They're just pulses. What happens when you add a melodic element? Well, examples 33 and 34 are also taken from the quartet for the end of time. 34 gives the melodic content. There are 16 notes. And then 33 is a series of non-retrogradable rhythms, one after the other, not the same ones. The rhythms themselves change, but it's a sequence of non-retrogradable rhythms. So, for example, the first measure takes the first 5 notes of the melody, from the D to the G sharp. So these. But you can see that the central note of the F sharp, the half note, contains, or is the central point of a non-retrogradable rhythm made up of the dotted 8th note and the tied quarter note, which then is retrograded. So you can see you have your retrograde relationship built into the non-retrogradable rhythm. My annoying little metronome there. And the next measure, same thing. Now you have the quarter note tied to a dotted 8th note. That's the central value. Retrograded cells are also made up of quarter notes and dotted eighth notes, but in this case they're not tied. So you have a quarter note and a dotted eighth note, the unit, a central value of a tied quarter note, dotted eighth note. And then that is the central value. So the B is the quarter note, the dotted eighth note tied, and then dotted eighth note to quarter note. Also with 5 of the melodic elements here from the A sharp. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1. Now, then the third measure, the central value is the quarter note tied to the 16th note. And then the balancing unit on the outside of the pattern is eighth, eighth, dotted eighth, and then retrograde, dotted eighth, eighth, eighth. Now, what's interesting in that third measure, the section that I just played through, is that the last note of that third measure, the D, is actually the first note of the melody. So at that point now, we've gone through the 16-note cycle, right? Right, the first measure is the first 5 notes from the D through the G sharp. The second measure is from the A sharp through the F sharp, also 5 notes. And then the third measure are the last 6 notes plus the first note for 7. You see actually that the example goes through the melodic content 3 times, right? And at the end of the third measure, the middle of the fourth measure, and then right at the beginning of the 6th measure there. So I'll play through it. There are actually 8 different units of non-retrogradability in sequence through here. And then the melodic units, the 4 repetitions of it. Retrogradability, non-retrogradability is also very important in serial music, the 12-tone music with the manipulation of the row. Composers like Schoenberg were writing before Messiaen, and then composers like Stockhausen or Boulez writing after. The development of the of row-based composition, Anton Webern, of course, as well. The idea of retrograde, non-retrograde is very important because there you have a set of 12 notes, 12 tones that are sequenced, and the sequence is very important. And then the transposition and the retrograde of that row is one of the key underlying structures of that music. That's not what's happening here, right? Whenever I yelled out D, it wasn't because we had now gone through each of the 12 chromatic pitches of the Western scale. It's because we had gone through the 16 notes sequence that Messiaen had defined as the melody. But you can see that there are repeated notes in it. Not all of them. There's an interesting melodic study to see where the centers are. C sharp is repeated, but D sharp is not. D natural is not repeated. F sharp is. The register of the melody here is maintained. Like Messiaen draws a distinction between the middle F and the high F, whereas in the 12-tone row, the note is separate from the pitch. So paragraph 3 of chapter 5, relation of non-retrogradable rhythms and modes of limited transposition. Again, we talked about this in an earlier episode. Non-retrogradable rhythms are those rhythms that are the same left to right as right to left. Modes of limited transpositions are the vertical arrangement of pitches. Messiaen says these modes cannot be transposed beyond a certain number of transpositions without falling again into the same notes, non-harmonically speaking. Now, he points out in chapters 16 through 19, we're going to get into the details of each of those modes. The point to consider right now is that there's a unity of harmony and rhythm that unfolds when you are using non-retrogradable rhythms and modes of limited transpositions. There's a commonality in the rhythmic pattern, that central duration. Likewise, in modes of limited transposition, there is a common pitch value in the middle of that mode. What Messiaen says, these modes, the harmonic modes, are divisible into symmetrical groups. The rhythms are also. The last note of each group of these modes is always common with the first of the following group, and the groups of these rhythms frame a central value common to each group. The analogy is now complete. So he's drawing an analogy between the rhythmic domain of non-retrogradability and the harmonic domain of limited transposition. Now, I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here. I cannot promise that it will be a fruitful tangent, but it will be a necessary tangent. The idea of analogy between domains is one that I think often. I think about it often when I'm composing in the electronic realm, where frequency and pitch are very subjective. But I'm particularly interested in the idea of different musical domains. The domain of amplitude, the domain of frequency. So let's say that Messiaen has drawn an analogy here between the rhythmic domain and the harmonic domain. So I see that also as an analogy between amplitude, just the wave shape, like a sine wave, is the representation in the amplitude domain. Right? Wavelength is a physical characteristic of amplitude. So if you have a flute that's playing a C, in the amplitude domain, you're going to see a nice sine wave where the amplitude changes evenly. Fair enough, that's amplitude. Now, but in the frequency domain, that same sound is represented by a single line. Right? If you were to do a spectrogram, like Fourier analysis of that same sine wave, now the amplitude has been removed from the display and you're seeing frequency. And the frequency is unchanged. So there's a relationship there between the representation of a sound in the frequency domain and the amplitude domain, where you can shift your perspective so that the change in the previous domain is removed and you see something constant. So I'm interested in that. So then you would say, well, what has the same relationship to frequency as frequency has to amplitude? If you have then that same flute player, flutist, playing a scale, frequency changes over time. So now you have frequency is the y-axis and time is the x-axis. Well, how do you flip it so that you need something where time is the y-axis, right? And I think that's where Messiaen is getting when he talks about the centrality of the analogy of non-retrogradability and limited transposition, that intersection of the two. The analogy that I'm thinking of, I think, gets into the mystery that Messiaen is trying to get to, because I think he's pointing to that ubiquity of harmony and rhythm suggests a stasis, a field beyond the unfolding of the music in the chronology, the linear chronology. The music becomes an object, an artifact that can exist outside of time. And what is outside of time? It's not no time. It's not no thing. It's a perspective that's indescribable in words. I'm evidently unable to describe it. So taking the diversion, the digression, the tangent, the tangential analogy, just a little bit further, I'm pulling up my book again. A link to this in the notes below. I brought this out in the first episode because I actually talk about Messiaen quite a lot in some of these essays. But I also talk about flatland. And I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs of the essay on flatland, which I call analogy. Because to me, the most interesting part of flatland is the mechanism of an analogy. In the Victorian quasi-novella cum mathematical disquisition qua moral critique called Flatland, Edward Abbott lays out the argument from analogy of figure. The argument is presented by a square speaking to a sphere. Now, sphere has shown square a new way of thinking about his world based on some unusual experiences previously unthinkable by a two-dimensional object. He, the square, is now trying to make an important point back to sphere. The argument by analogy is set up to show that there are consistent relationships between the inhabitants of different dimensions and the forms produced by the motion of those entities. Square begins with a restatement of the lesson from a land with only one dimension. If you take a point, he says, did not a moving point produce a line with two terminal points? He continues, did not a moving line produce a square with four terminal points? Elaborating further, in three dimensions, did not a moving square produce that blessed being, a cube with 8 terminal points? This understanding of 3 dimensions is the new realization for square, and it is central to the book, to Flatland. Then finally, the point of the argument, Square says, and in 4 dimensions shall not a moving cube, also for analogy and alas for the progress of truth, if it be not so, shall not, I say, the motion of the divine cube result in a still more divine organization with 16 terminal points? Right? It's the analogy. And then you could go on from there. What happens? That object with 16 terminal points moving would have 32 terminal points. On and on. So the analogy, it's the relationship that's important. Now, I end the introduction by saying, fair enough for the progress of truth, but sadly for square, this last point was not the reason that sphere had shown square the 3rd dimension. Thus insulted, sphere arranges for square to be imprisoned, and it is from his prison cell that square writes Flatland. So, the analogy is complete. I enjoyed that tangent. I hope you did too. Back to Messiaen. Let us think now of the hearer of our modal and rhythmic music. He will not have time at the concert to inspect the non-transpositions and the non-retrogradations. Pause there for a minute. Messiaen isn't saying that you need to be able to identify these patterns. The same way that in Schoenberg or Webern, you do not need to recognize the manipulation of the row in order to be able to experience the music. And in fact, you could say that the analysis of Webern to identify the manipulations of the row is almost as unnecessary a tangent as might a little bit about Flatland there. Anyway, inspect the non-transpositions and the non-retrogradations. And at that moment, these questions will not interest him further. To be charmed will be his only desire. Remember how the first chapter is called The Charm of Impossibility? The impossibility, the arrangement of impossibilities with the impossibility of retrogradation and the impossibility of many transpositions. Right? So we talk about limited transposition, non-retrogradability. What Messiaen is really talking about is the impossibility of either of those, and that this impossibility is a charm. That state, that different perspective where the domains are merged, or the step, you move to a domain a step beyond, or a step directed in. To be charmed will be his only desire, and that is precisely what will happen. In spite of himself, he will submit to the strange charm of impossibilities. A certain effect of tonal ubiquity in the non-transposition, a certain unity of movement where beginning and end are confused because identical in the non-retrogradation. All things which will lead him progressively to that sort of theological rainbow which the musical language of which we seek edification and theory attempts to be. My goodness, there's so much in that. Right? This is such a short chapter, and the concept is so freaking simple, right? Non-retrograde rhythm. Two retrogrades surrounding a single shared element. But look where Messiaen goes with it. The tonal ubiquity in the non-transposition. That word ubiquity, it just says it all for me. If you take charm and ubiquity, that is the step beyond the understood domains into the mystery, and Messiaen calls that the theological rainbow. Now, he uses theological rainbow throughout his writing career, and it sort of encompasses these rhythmic elements, these harmonic elements, bird song, aspects of the mystery of Catholicism. It is a rainbow theology because it is physical and physiological as well as theological. It is historical as well as mysterious. All of that thrown in. And this idea of the music charming through the ubiquity of a single union of rhythm and retrograde is so important. So now this is where I'm going to get into Neumes. So those of you who have been waiting patiently for the medieval music, here we are. So remember, Messiaen is first and foremost a church musician. When he writes music for concert performance or opera, he's writing for it in the same way that Wagner wrote opera. It is because the necessary availability of those resources exists in the concert hall, but the experience should always be taken as liturgical, as the drama unfolding of the mystery, of a realization of this sensation. The charm and the ubiquity is our physical experience of it, but that's merely the entry point into the actual mystery of the experience. In this, Messiaen is definitely of his time, right? Now, one thing I'll say, you can always say that the Catholic Church or any institution is always in a period of reevaluation or conflict. It's always true. You can say that the Catholic Church was undergoing a revitalization and an internal discussion about meaning in the first half of the 20th century. You could say that. You could also say the same thing about the Catholic Church in the second part of the 16th century, or in the first part of the 9th century. The statement is sort of dumb. But what's interesting, whether it's the Catholic Church or the Bon Buddhism or Zen Buddhism moving to America, there's never a period of non-change. There's never a period without challenges. The question is, what are those challenges, and then how are they answered, and what happens with those answers. So now what's interesting in the early part of the 20th century is that a major part of this discussion focused around music. Now, you could say the same thing in the 9th century when Pope Gregory notated Gregorian chant in the first place in order to have a consistent liturgy across Europe, across the Catholic Church. Music was central to the theological discussion then. You could say that music was central to the theological discussion every year from 900 to 1910 to 2010. Particular interesting element in the early part of the 20th century was the publication of a scholarly edition of Gregorian chant from the monks of Salem. An enormous endeavor, still going on today. The paleographic study of Gregorian chant is an absolutely fascinating realm of musicology. I actually took some seminars when I was a graduate student looking at this process and the current state, which then was in the early 90s, so nearly 20 years ago now, so I'm sure it's changed a lot since then. But the publication of the updated notation of Gregorian chant without any of the additions that had been put to the chant in the previous 400 years? I don't know. Think about the kind of music that Tallis wrote, or the Allegri Miserere. That's chant that has been embellished to a point of polyphony where it is no longer chant. Now, I'm particularly fond of music from 13th century or so. The French Gothic composers like Perrotin, where you have melismatic adjustments to the chant. You have, if not polyphony, at least multiple voices, even if they're often in simple parallel motions. Organum. There are some basic elements of extending chant. So the idea of the Salem work was that all of that was not an embellishment, certainly not an improvement, actually a degradation of the chant. The scholarly question is, how do you notate this? And the manuscripts that we have from 1,000 years ago use these square note notations. There is no time signature. There is no key signature. There's only 4 staffs instead of 5. The notes are square, except where they're not. And when they're not, they are written as these sort of neumes, these gestural codes. Now, the thing to remember with this notation is that it is first and foremost about the articulation of the text, of the liturgy. When you see the notation, the study of the notation, you have to be able to understand how to identify the pitch. But you have to be able to read the neumes rhythmically as well. And this is where there's the interesting overlap with what we were just talking about with Messiaen and non-retrogradable rhythms, because a non-retrogradable rhythm is a unit. It's a set of relationships. And particularly when it's held together with a mode of limited transposition, you have 2 sets of relationships. And it's the relationships that are more important than the actual pitch contents. And the same way with the notation with neumes, each of the shapes gives an indication of how many pulses are associated with each syllable, whether it's 1 pulse per syllable, multiple pulses per syllable, multiple pulses with different pitches per syllable, right? The chant itself has a clear pulse. Again, you can see how this is similar to the idea of ametricality that we talked about with Messiaen, where he's looking at a small pulse broken up into ametrical units of differing sizes, and then within those units are these non-retrogradable or retrogradable rhythms. You could almost imagine a Messiaen score written out without pitch, but with sort of an agreed convention of graphic notation that says within this cell you have 17 pulses that are arranged equally around this non-retrograde rhythm. It feels to me like the use of standard Western notation by Messiaen is just a convention, and that his music could have as easily, perhaps more effectively, have been written out with a series of neumes. Different convention, but one where you really are highlighting the relationship between the mode of the chant, the pitch content, and the breakout of the rhythm. So look, obviously this isn't a study on neumes, and we'll come back to this more as we get into it. But from this and from the images that we've just looked at, I want you to get the idea that when you look at a Messiaen score, whether it's the quartet for the End of Time or whether it's some of the organ pieces, really look at these patterns. Like look at the examples that we saw today, and think about how they could have been represented not as a series of pitches and rhythms, but as a gesture, right? All right, so we've gone over this a couple of times now. The first exercise was just a couple of measures where I alternated different rhythmic cells, and then I came back in the last time and added in repetition, and then some augmentation, some inexact augmentation. What I'm going to do today is take the first four measures, and I'm going to turn them into retrograde rhythms, just as we did with the, just as we saw with the quartet. So the first measure here, with my 16th note, 8th note, dotted 8th note, 8th note, I am going to take this 8th note, I'm going to turn it into a half note, and I'm going to use that as my central value. So at first it's going to look very much the same. There's my half note right there. Put a big accent over it. In this first example, I'm just going to do it an exact retrograde, and I'm going to use like that. So then I'm going to do it for each of these other measures. So, and again, I'm going to take the last note here, and I'm going to make it a half note each time. There. And then retrograde. But now I want to do something a bit more interesting for the second part, which is this nice melody here. So I'm going to keep that. I'm going to take this here and make that my retrograde rhythm, which without clef then would look like this. The quarter tied to a 16th note is very Messiaen-y, right? And then a 16th, and then a quarter tied to a dotted 8th. And I'm going to make this be my shared value. And then again the 16th tied to the quarter. So if I take that rhythm and apply it to the notes, I'm going to have F sharp, and then a D, and then the C, so no change so far. Then I'm going to have a G, a D, and another D, but now I'm flipping back, right? Because I want to use my full allotment. And an F sharp, and then a G, so I'm here, right? So I got through my melody, I got halfway through the rhythm, and then I'm breaking out. I imagine if I were to continue, I would extend out and have that be much longer. So these measures here now replace the first two here.
Thank you.